Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. As we begin the first Transit Commission meeting for 2018, I'm pleased to say that we'll be continuing our tradition of starting each meeting by recognizing OC Transpo TransSecure recipients. Je suis ravi d'annoncer en ce début de notre toute première réunion de 2018 de la Commission de transport en commun que nous allons continuer la tradition de commencer chacune d'entre elles rendant hommage aux lauréats de la prix TransSecure d'OC Transpo. For those who may not be familiar with the TransSecure program, it's a well-established community watch program on wheels. OC Transpo employees look out for the safety of all community members and, as a result, become the eyes and ears of our community. They notify emergency services when required and assist individuals who are in distress. Today we will hear 3 inspiring stories from the months of September, October, and November 2017. Vous allez entendre aujourd'hui l'histoire inspirante des 3 lauréats de la prix TransSecure des mois de septembre, octobre et novembre 2017. On September 24th, around 10:30 a.m., bus operator Mike was stationed near Confederation Square, about to begin his regular shift on Route 12, when he suddenly witnessed a young male in the distance fall and begin to have a seizure. The parents of the young man were with their son. However, it was evident that they needed help. Mike immediately ran over, offered assistance, and quickly called the Transit Operations Control Center for support. Remaining calm, Mike stayed on the site with the young man and his parents until paramedics arrived on the scene. Thanks to Mike's prompt and professional response when faced with a medical emergency, the young man in distress was taken care of calmly and safely. On the evening of September 26th, bus operator Dennis was driving along Rideau Street on Route 18. A male boarded the bus with a 2-year-old boy. Before the bus left the stop, a female ran up to the bus door and told Dennis not to leave, as the man had taken the child without permission. Dennis immediately notified the Transit Operations Control Center to make them aware of the situation that was developing on his bus, and he requested assistance. The Control Center quickly advised the Ottawa Police Service, who confirmed they would attend to the call. Dennis was able to keep the child safe and unharmed until police arrived shortly thereafter. Following some negotiations with the police, the man eventually relinquished the child to them. The man was subsequently arrested and charged. Thanks to Dennis's quick thinking and reactive nature, the child was kept safe and unharmed. And on the evening of November 2nd, bus operator Haley was driving Route 131 on Jeanne d'Arc Boulevard when she came upon a 6-year-old boy walking alone in the rain without a jacket. Concerned that the boy might be lost, Haley pulled over and stopped her bus. She asked the boy if he was okay and brought him on board the bus to keep him safe and out of the rain. Haley proceeded to notify the Transit Operations Control Center, and shortly thereafter, special constables and the Ottawa Police arrived on the scene. It turned out that the Ottawa Police had been looking for the boy. They had been contacted after the boy decided to walk home on his own from the Bob Macquarie Recreation Center. Thanks to Haley's observation, quick action, and caring nature, the Ottawa Police were able to reunite the boy with his parents. I'm very happy that Mike, Dennis, and Haley are all here with us this morning, and I would like to invite them up here to the podium to receive their certificates. Mike. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first Transit Commission meeting for 2018. We are going to start with the confirmation of the minutes, minutes 26 from December 4, 2017. Carried. Thank you very much. First, are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none. The first item is the status update. Transit Commission motions increase for the period ending 14 February 2018. That the Commission receive the report for information. Is this received? Received. Thank you. Item number 2 is amendments to the transit bylaw for multimodal operations, and there's a presentation on that, and so we'll jump right to that. Mr. Scrimgeour, Jocelyn, Troy, Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a short presentation to walk you through the high points of this report recommending changes to update the transit bylaw to be ready for the multimodal operations that will begin when the O-Train Confederation line opens later this year. To give some background, the current bylaw in its current form was enacted in 2007, and it goes on for a number of pages to lay out the rules and the regulations for fares, transfers, priority seating on vehicles, how customers and staff should conduct themselves, regulations on how the transitway is to operate, park and ride lots, and how we can enforce these different measures. What we're recommending here fall into 4 categories. One is to regulate how bicycles are carried on trains. One is to allow small pets on board transit vehicles. One is to regulate buskers or street performers at transit stations. And the 4th category is a number of technical amendments to keep the wording in the bylaw current with current fare policy and current provincial legislation relating to carrying people with disabilities. So first of all, on bicycles, our recommendation is to allow bicycles on board trains outside peak periods, and that would be new. To direct staff to be able to have the authority to manage bicycles and whether carried at particularly busy times when there's sudden overcrowding. And therefore to give authority to staff through the general manager to permit and regulate the carriage of bicycles. We're making these recommendations to adhere to council policy to support and encourage sustainable transportation and multimodal connections. Certainly to take advantage of the major investment in the Confederation Line project to handle bicycles. We want to remove artificial barriers so that there is no prohibition on people taking bicycles on trains. We want to encourage people to use bicycles, cycling, and as well as local buses for connections. We've seen people bicycling to stations from 1, 2, 5, maybe even further kilometers away, and to be consistent with other transit agencies with rail as we're moving into our first operation of a very high capacity rail system. Without having that experience, we look to the experience of others to inform us. Every station on the Confederation line and most other transit stations across the city have bicycle parking, and so a lot of people already do, and a lot of people will want to bring their bicycles to a station and park them at the station. We have open air parking, we have covered parking like this, and thanks to some federal and municipal funding, this year we'll be installing enclosed parking at selected locations. So there's a wide variety of parking available now, and by the time the Confederation line opens, we'll have well over 1,000 parking spaces for bicycles across the many, many stations on our network. For those who choose to carry the bicycle onto the train, here's a couple of pictures using the mock-up that show how a bicycle would be walked onto the train carefully, never ridden on the platform or ridden onto the train, and how the customer could stand or sit with their bicycle in the multi-purpose area. The multi-purpose area is designed on our trains for this reason. It's for people to stand or sit with their bicycles, with their luggage, with strollers they're carrying, but most importantly for people who have disabilities and are using a mobility device such as a wheelchair or scooter. That's a a place for them to park and wait. And the difference in the multipurpose area is that the seats, as you can see there, spring up and have to be pulled down for someone to sit. And there's the contrasting area to show the limits of the multipurpose area. This is a drawing showing the kind of information that we could display at the entrance to a station. So you see it's the front door of Tremblay Station, and on the right the information panel we would put up to advise customers on how to conduct themselves, walk their bike through the station, and make sure that everyone's aware of the regulations before they enter into the station. On the station platform, we would mark an area, here we're showing it in green, where we would direct customers to stand. It's at the far front of the train, and at almost every station that's away from the busiest point on the platform. Then we would have that sign that people could see that this is where you walk your bicycle onto the train, and that green marked area lines up with the first door on the train. The current situation is the bicycles can be carried on buses during the summer months only, from April to October. About 2/3 of our buses are equipped with bicycle racks during the summer months, and we have about 10 routes on which we guarantee or work as hard as we can to make sure that every bus on those routes has a bicycle rack. Also, bicycles can now be carried on the O-Train Trillium line, rather than what we would do on the Confederation line of saying it's always the first door. On the Trillium line trains, because there's only 2 doors, it would be at the door that's marked with a bicycle symbol. We looked at a number of transit systems that have high-capacity rail operations across North America, including 5 in Canada. All of those agencies allowed bicycles on board trains. All of them had restrictions under certain conditions. Most of them have a provision for staff to manage bicycles, such as after major events or other times when there's a severe overcrowding. So this table, which is also in your report, lists all of the stations, all of the systems that we examined their bicycle procedures on, and you'll see that all of the Canadian systems that have rail operations, we're following their lead in recommending that we initially allow bicycles at the off-peak times of the day and of the week. Our next recommendation is on to allow pets onto trains and buses. Our recommendations are to allow small pets on board buses and trains at all times, transported in an animal carrier or crate that can rest on the customer's lap, a handheld carrier that can rest on their lap. The reasons we're recommending this, it would allow pet owners to use transit when they're taking their pet to appointments, such as to the groomers, the vets, the city's spay-neuter clinic. Right now, someone who doesn't have a car is barred from using transit for this kind of travel. Having a carrier or crate, in addition to defining the size of the pet, keeping it small without introducing artificial measurements, would also reduce the contact between the pets and other customers on the trains and buses. There's a history of pet owners requesting this policy. There's some examples listed in the report of times when people have come to the Transit Commission previously. And it's consistent with most transit agencies in Canada and the U.S. The background is that the current bylaw prohibits people from bringing any animal other than a service animal identified by an assistant card onto transit property. Service animals, of course, are permitted and must be permitted, but that means that transit customers can't take their pets to appointments by transit, and that leaves those people to search for other means of transport. We looked at 18 other transit systems across the continent, including 6 in Canada. All of them allow pets on board. Most of them require customers to have the pet in a carrier at all times. Some, a small number, allow the pets to be either on a leash or in a carrier. And this table, which is also in the report, lists that every one of the transit agencies that we looked at does allow pets on board. The third is to seek policy direction on buskers or street performers. We're recommending to allow buskers to perform in designated locations and stations. These would be areas that are near the busy parts of stations, but off the main passenger flow, where they can conduct a good business, entertain our customers, keep it lively, but not block passenger flow through the station. We're asking you to direct us to develop a procedure to audition, approve, register, and schedule these performers so that there's not conflict between them and not, let's say, less qualified performers working in the stations. The reasons that we're recommending that, we're recommending an improved customer experience. It certainly livens up stations. If anyone who's had experience traveling to other cities around the world, there's an increased community involvement. People who are musicians or other forms of performers have an ability to get out and perform in their community. And it really makes people feel safer and more secure because there's just more activity and there's another pair of eyes in that corridor, in that concourse. Some background on that. The current situation is that the bylaw prohibits people from playing a musical instrument except with staff permission, and it also prohibits people from begging, soliciting, or panhandling. We looked at 12 other cities, most of which allow busking on transit. We also looked at the procedures in place here in Ottawa and the Byward Market and on Spark Street. Almost all of the programs we looked at require auditions and a license or permit. Some require a fee, and we're not recommending a fee. So this table here shows those other transit systems and other cities, and just like in Ottawa where there's different cases depending on who administers the space, that's also similar in Montreal and in Calgary. So those are our three main recommendations. The next steps for this report, after you consider it today, it'll go to Council for consideration next week. Following that, Council would be asked to enact the bylaw to formally put it into place. The amendments to the bylaw would come into effect on April 2nd, and based on that policy direction and the new bylaw being in place, we would design that customer material, such as you saw for signage, or all the other custom material that we have to ready for people who are going to be new to using rail rapid transit when the Confederation line comes on board. So, Mr. Chair, that's our presentation, and happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scrimgeour. There's a small technical amendment that Councillor Tierney will read, and then we'll go to public delegations.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chair. It's just actually an amendment to the table. It is in all the documentation. So it's therefore be resolved that the report be amended to substitute the revised table number 2 attached for this motion for table 2 in the report, and revising the discussion section to reflect all 18 agencies that allow pets on board transit vehicles.
This was just a change STO from no to yes, I think, basically, right? Is that carried? Carried? Yeah, thank you. We'll go to public delegations now. Our first delegate is Sabrina Phoenix. Good morning, Sabrina. Thank you for coming. You have 5 minutes, and if I think you're going to run out of time, I'll try to give you a signal so you can start to wrap up.
Good morning, members of the Transit Commission Committee. My name is Sabrina Phoenix, and I'm here as one of the many Ottawa citizens that would benefit from the allowance of pets on board transit vehicles and in stations. I personally have no access to a personal vehicle, so I rely primarily on transit for the majority of my travel, and I am also a pet owner. I'm a university student, so I must be very smart with my finances. And I'm also well aware that other residents in this city are in also low-income situations. Through my tuition, I received the U-Pass, which raises the cost of a monthly pass, and with the recent addition of the Equipass, more people are able to access the transit system, but they're still unable to transport their pets. Whether it be to a vet appointment, a grooming salon, a daycare, or other amenities that are not located within walking distance to their home, finding transportation can be quite difficult and expensive. To get to the closest vet clinic from my personal apartment is an average $25 round trip. with a taxi service or Uber. That being said, there's still no guarantee that the drivers would allow my pets in their vehicle, as concerns recently have been raised regarding service dogs on board taxis and Uber services. Allowing pets on public transit would eliminate these extra costs and give many people more peace of mind regarding their ownership. I'm also very active on social media, and since the initial mention of this topic, I've been researching many different perspectives and concerns. The most common is the risk of other passengers experiencing an allergic reaction due to the animal's presence. On a regular day, the amount of pet hair, dander, and saliva I have present on my clothing and personal belongings, I believe is far more superior than what my animal would produce while in their carrier on board the bus or train. There is also an option for people to either move or request that the pet be moved to a different seat should they be concerned regarding an allergic reaction. The size of the carrier as well has also been mentioned, but as I've learned, the requirements of the carrier are that they must be small enough to fit on the owner's lap. This is approximately the size of many backpacks, gym bags, and other groceries that people may have on board the transit. And there are minimal issues and complaints regarding people having large backpacks on the bus as well. I personally own 3 cats, one of which actually took the airplane and flew with me when I initially moved out here to Ottawa. Her name is Nemo, and she's one of the most social cats that I've ever met. When the weather is nice, we go on walks and have gone to Majors Hill Park multiple times to meet new people and socialize with the tourists. And I've also recently been wanting to get into the pet therapy volunteer program with the City of Ottawa that they offer, and so that would involve driving to different senior centers throughout the city and socializing with them to kind of brighten their day. But unfortunately, many of the locations are too far for me to either bike or walk to, and so I have not been able to pursue any opportunities yet. So allowing her on board the transit would definitely open that door for me. Through the examples I've presented you with today, I hope that this has allowed you to put a face to this issue and learn how truly beneficial allowing small pets on transit would be. Thank you for your time, and have a nice day.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for the delegation? No. Thank you very much for coming in this morning. Our next delegate is Julie Ivanoff from Bike Ottawa. Julie? Here we go. Thanks for coming this morning, Julie, and I'll try to give you a quick wave if you're going to run out of time. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Council. My name is Julie Ivanoff, and I'm representing Bike Ottawa. And I want to say first off that we're really excited about accessing the LRT and how that actually is going to provide even more options for multimodal transportation and continuing along the bike ride bike system that you're proposing, and encouraging more options for sustainable transportation, healthy transportation, active transportation. So with that, in speaking of the future, we know that we're expecting a lot of growth, and even though the Confederation line is going to be open from Blair to Sunny's Pasture, we're going to expect the expansion, so that way all of the existing suburbs are going to have even more access and easier access to downtown. So what would be useful is if we could encourage use of bikes and use of bikes in connecting with existing cycling infrastructure, and also in providing excellent bike parking facilities, encourage the use of the LRT. So with that, this is a new launch, and so this is an opportunity to study travel patterns, and with that, I would like to encourage that bikes are allowed on trains for the launch, to study exactly how they're used, how many bicycles are actually carried onto the trains, and what types of people are using it. Currently, there are over 600 buses or so with the bike racks that are available for half of the year, and also bikes are allowed to be carried onto the O train. So with those existing practices, some people who are already using that and connecting downtown, or have the expectation that trains should be permitted by bikes, it might be good to consider extending that towards the LRT. It may be easier to make adjustments to that. So if there are too many bicycles, then start restricting times, or maybe having only so many bicycles per train or so many bicycles per area at the discretion of the drivers. We're not opposed to that. But those changes, it's encouraged that those changes are made according to data that's received. And so with this launch, not in peak cycling season. We're not expecting to see too many bicycles, and at the same time with good parking facilities and our existing cycling network, we see that there probably won't be, we doubt that there will be conflicts with passengers and too many bicycles on the trains. Also to consider the users, so again, people who rely on rack and roll, and also to encourage active transportation, so perhaps people who cannot make an entire trip, round trip, this gives them an option to take the LRT or use buses and connecting to public transit to help supplement their ride. Also, in very difficult weather, this offers another option to remove cyclists from the roads, and so that way if it's rainy or snowy or icy or foggy, they have other options and they don't have to be on the road, so that might actually help encourage safe transportation. In regards to the studies in other cities, those designs are from transit that's been used or built in the 1980s. This is a new system, this is the future, and I think that there will be a way that we can accommodate all the parties. So please consider allowing bicycles until we can understand how they're using it and how that will impact the users. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Julie, for your presentation. Are there any questions for the presenter? Seeing none, thanks very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Excuse me, our next, sorry, no, that ends the public delegate. Oh, no, there's one. We have Kalman Estru. Good morning, Mr. Is it Estru?
Estrin.
Estru, thank you very much for coming this morning. And if you see me waving, it's because you're running out of time and you can start to wrap up. You have 5 minutes.
My name is Kalman Estru. I'm a senior citizen, a resident of Ottawa, and I am a bicycle enthusiast. I look at this report, and this report has nothing but fluff in it. It's got no substance to it. It doesn't tell us how many people use the rack and roll. It just says it's a successful program. It says the rack and roll system will continue on unchanged, yet as far as I understand, something like 95% of the buses that go into the downtown core during rush hour won't go into the downtown core. It doesn't tell us what the capacity on the train is for bicycles. It limits bicyclists to one entry, while there's 14 doors and there's multi-use areas more than one place on that train. You don't have any statistics here. You've got a whole list of various locations, other cities that use trains, but don't provide any information as to how they're comparable with us. Calgary Transit built their C-train system starting in the 1970s. As far as I remember, and I lived there until about 15 years ago, it was never designed for bicycles. There was no provision for it. This one is designed and has provision for bicycles. We're saying less restricted to off-peak hours, but the bylaw recommendation changes basically give the general manager the ability to say no bicycles at all on this train, just by the wording of the bylaw changes. I'm sure that they didn't just compare themselves to 17 other systems, but the report only mentions those 7. Another question that I have is what is the actual capacity for bike storage at Blair, Herdman, and Tunney's Pasture, which are the 3 focal points for all of those buses that currently travel through the downtown core, because they're not going to. You know, those buses are going to stop, offload, and turn around and go out. And all those people who are using rack and roll are going to be having to find a place to store their bikes. Again, we don't have statistics provided to us on the rack and roll. How many people use it between 6 and 7 in the morning, between 7 and 8, between 8 and 9, between 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 5? There's no information here. Where do these people go? Do they actually travel from across the downtown? Do they go from, say, Blair to Tunney's? Do they go just from a location in the far west to Tunney's? Do they go from the downtown out? There's no information here. This report has nothing but fluff and a statement about the rack and roll that is misleading because most of those buses, if not all of them, other than the 12, which is one of the designated rack and roll routes, will not be in the downtown because all of those buses are going to stop going through the downtown. So I, as a senior who has some physical limitations, who want to take my bicycle to my office downtown and ride it home, am being told, no, you can't get your bike downtown because there's not a bus route that is going to take you where there is currently. I won't be able to take my bike on the O train. So, I mean, is this a good change? Is this properly thought out? Is it properly expressed? Do you have the information that's necessary? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Esther. Are there any questions for the delegate? No? Thank you very much for coming up this morning. We have Jean-Philippe Tarinsky. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. You have 5 minutes. If you see me waving, it is probably time to wrap up. Just press the button.
Okay. Good morning. So I'm here today because I'm disappointed about the ban on cycles during rush hour times. I get around by bike, and it seems that if the train, as it's designed right now, is going to be so full at 6 o'clock in the morning that there's no room for any bikes at all in the train, then it's going to be a disaster. Either this train is way too small for the amount of people that are going to be using it, or the policy doesn't make sense, and it should be the hours where bikes are banned should be reduced. Now, in coming up with the policy, I think we need evidence and we need a rational approach. It looks like what happened was the committee looked at other cities and saw what they were doing, chose the trailing half, because the majority of those cities on the report allow bikes at all times. The minority ban bikes during rush hour. So we went with the minority and decided to ban them without evidence, like how many people are expected to ride their bikes onto the train. There's no evidence of that. Also, of the people currently taking their bikes on, what times are they going at? Again, it's not sure. Is it really just between 8 and 9 that there's a problem and the expected capacity is going to be too low? Or is it really from 6 to 9? If that's the case, then I'd like to see the numbers. This train is only the first phase of a longer approach, right? So with phase 2, 70% of Ottawa is going to be within 5 kilometers of the train. In that case, taking the train with your bike will make perfect sense. Anyone can bike pretty much 5 kilometers. It's a couple minutes, you get to the train, you hop on, and then you continue on to the end of your journey. If you're at Moody or Riverside South and you want to go out to Orleans, it's a pretty far way to go by bike. But taking the train would make that a nice journey to do. You could go from Riverside South, take your bike onto the train, go to Orleans, get off. But if for 6 hours of the day you're not able to do that, then there's no other alternative, because currently people can do the rock and roll, but with this approach that's proposed, people will take their bikes onto the bus, rock and roll to the train, and then they're stuck. So I think what I'd like to propose is that have an evidence-based approach to this. Before we jump to any conclusions, look at the actual evidence. And then also, in the absence of any evidence, take a wait and see. Let's make a policy like if the train is full, then you can't bring your bike on board. But if there's room, then bring it on board. It's very common sense that passengers should have the priority over bikes. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tarinsky. Are there any questions for the speaker? Seeing none, thank you very much for coming out this morning. There are no other speakers on the list, so we're going to close delegations. I do have a speakers list going, so if you'd like to ask questions, let me know. Councillor Tierney, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a few questions to staff in regards to the pet side of things. I was noticing that it mentions small animals, so I have to think it's probably more than just cats and dogs. It could be snakes on a train. Who knows? Maybe Noah's Ark by the end of the day. What kind of animals would be allowed on the train? Are we talking exotic animals as well? Spiders, snakes, different things like that?
Snakes on the train.
Mr. Chair, I'll draw your attention to page 19 of the report. That lays out what the bylaw would say, and it would say that no animal may be brought on the train unless the animal is transported in an enclosed handheld container, such as in an animal carrier or crate, that is secured at all times, such that the animal does not inconvenience or jeopardize the safety of other persons or transit property, and subject to any other conditions as may be imposed by the director. So the bylaw would provide that animals may be brought on board if they're in the enclosed handheld container, as we said, that it's small enough to be kept on someone's lap and keeps the animal from interacting with other passengers on the train. It doesn't specify, we wouldn't specify what sorts of animals that could be.
Okay, so yes, you can have snakes or skunks. I'm looking at the other transit groups that have done this. Do they have any restrictions on what type of pets? Do they ever say just cats, dogs?
Some of them have restrictions on size.
Okay.
I don't know whether they have, I don't think that they get into the details of what species or breeds of animals are allowed.
Okay, so I'll do a little research on that before this goes to any further. I'm looking at sound violations, barking, things like that might take place from a small animal. Small animals have big barks. How does an operator deal with a situation like that?
Mr. Chair, I'd suggest that it's the customer bringing the pet's responsibility to bring the pet on board only if they know it's not going to disturb other passengers on the train. If they find that it does, then they should be finding another way of traveling.
Okay, and I was looking back in history. I guess we went through this before our times on council. I guess in 2008 they attempted to do a pilot. Did that pilot go ahead?
No, it did not. The Commission didn't proceed with it.
And can you tell me why that would be?
I don't have information on why the Commission made the decision they made.
Okay, so we've done this before, it failed, and I'm not really sure why, but I guess I look at some of what I surmised because I had to go through and read some of the minutes. I guess OPH came back with rabies, pet feces, and urine being some of the challenges from animals. And that's, unfortunately, I think how the vote fell back then. So I just want to know, is there new information now that's changed it? Is it just because more transit groups are moving in this direction, do you feel?
Well, there's certainly been, Mr. Chair, continued interest from our customers in being able to travel with their pets. When we speak to OPH, they tell us, as documented here, that all of the concerns that they have can be managed by our procedures. And when we look at transit systems across the continent, no other major transit system has the kind of restrictions that we have in Ottawa.
Okay. And forgive me, I do have a couple questions that I'm asking on behalf of another councillor as well that's not on this committee. Is there any costs, and forgive me if it's in the document, I looked through, I didn't see anything. Is there any cost implications on startup, enforcement that are a part of it?
No, there are no costs for any of these things. They'd all be done as part of our normal work. Great.
And also, is there warnings when somebody comes on to the train or a bus with a carrier, it might have a cat in it? Is there warnings that someone's coming on the bus?
Are you suggesting warnings to the customer with the pet or warnings to other customers?
It would be to the other customers, and this is just raised because of people with severe allergies. It is a concern, so I was asked to ask that question. I think it's a fair question.
No, we'd be providing information to all customers, but there's no means of communicating to other customers on any vehicle if somebody's bringing anything with them as they travel.
So I guess undoubtedly there will be a situation where there will be a customer riding one of our vehicles that will have severe allergies. They will bring this forward to the operator, I assume. What happens in that scenario? Is it the pet that wins, or is it the customer?
If anyone on our system now or in the future has any sort of medical emergency, our staff are ready and trained to help them with that and to call the appropriate emergency response people right away.
Okay, so the operator wouldn't make that decision and say, sorry, somebody's identified, they have a severe allergic reaction, we don't have an EpiPen. That's my other question. We don't have an EpiPen, you'll have to wait for the next train or bus. That wouldn't be part of our procedures?
Mr. Chair, that would not be part of our procedures. That's correct. We have currently no special protection for people who come into contact with any sort of allergen. We have the advice from OPH that all of the allergens that people have from pets are just as likely to be carried on in the clothes of other customers as they are by the pet itself. But we're ready to help in any case of a medical emergency.
Okay, wonderful. And I do have a question related to the bicycle side. Where the bikes go on to the trains, would this be also an area where it could be scooters or baby carriages as well?
When the trains during the week will run as a 2-car train, and there are 4 multi-purpose areas designated on each car, so there'll be 8 per train. By asking the cyclists to move to the far end, to the first door of the train, and to use the first multi-purpose area that'll be adjacent to that door, that ensures that the other 7 multi-purpose areas will remain available for people who are using scooters, wheelchairs, bringing luggage with them, have strollers with them, anything else that's taking up space. In choosing that first door, we're first of all inspired by the example of Montreal, who does the same, that it's very easy to watch, very easy to communicate, and we're also checking against the design of the stations. The main flow of customers is all but one of the platforms away from that location, and at every station, the main location where people with disabilities would be coming to the platform by elevator is quite some distance away from that first door of the train. So that would be of the 8 multipurpose areas per train, that's the one where there would always be the least conflict or contention for space with other customers who need that space.
Okay, so again, just from the operator perspective, the train's a little different. I mean, they're up in the front cab, so it's not the same, I assume, versus a bus where they're open environment, they're right there. If there's a bike, a stroller, and a rascal or a scooter gets onto the vehicle, and there's no more space, again, does the operator make a determination who wins in that scenario?
On the trains, Mr. Chair, the operator does not interact with customers. The operator is in his or her cab taking care of the safe operation of the train, responding to emergencies, but not guiding the customers on how to behave. So we need regulations in place and information in place that will guide customers to the right location so they won't end up in conflict with each other.
Okay, great. And so, Mr. Chair, I've got a lot of questions still in my mind. I'll wait for the rest of the colleagues to ask their questions. I'm sure they'll be in the same vein. I do ask, so these seem like 2 very different issues at the end of the day, pets and bicycles. Does this have to be voted on as one individual item, or can this be split?
Yeah, they're listed as separate, so we can certainly split it during the voting. That's no problem.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Tierney. Councillor Deans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm here to talk about bicycles on trains. As you all know, currently the Trillium line allows bicycles on trains all the time, not just off-peak hours. So I'm wondering, Mr. Scrimgeour, the nature of the complaints and how many complaints we've had about bicycles on the Trillium line.
There's a very small number. As we look back through history, there's been a very small number of comments related to carriage bicycles on the Trillium line.
So really no concerns expressed by our riders about bikes on trains?
That's correct.
And in the report, you reference a number of other transit agencies, transit services. Can you tell me the nature of their complaints and how many complaints they have had?
I can tell you that the one agency that we reached out to discuss this in more depth, as we do for so many things, Calgary is a great comparator for Ottawa, being another cold city, another city the same size, many, many more years of experience with rail operations. We particularly asked them whether, because they're in the same situation, they're operators in the cab and not able to supervise the train. We asked them in particular, did they have any problem enforcing? Was there difficulty in people complying with the rules of not bringing your bikes on board during peak periods? And they told us, no, people just follow the rules.
Okay, so, but the other transit agencies, you really have not heard any information that would suggest there's a problem with bikes on trains, even at peak times?
We certainly know that a number of the cities, especially the Canadian cities, have asked cyclists to travel with their bicycles other than at off-peak times to keep the full capacity available on the train. So, we're recommending something that is consistent with other cities across the country.
Okay, well, my problem is the constituents that I represent primarily are users of the Trillium Line, and the Trillium Line currently allows bicycles on the train all the time. So when I read this report, this report says the recommended policy changes would permit customers to bring bicycles on board trains. It should actually say the recommended policy changes would reduce service on the Trillium Line from the current service, because that's effectively what we're doing. We're taking away the ability for those transit riders who currently use the peak service and take their bikes on board not to be allowed to do that anymore, with what I can see as no evidence at all of any problems associated with it. So I'm here to ask you not to do that, and I'm just here to remind you that this is a customer-oriented service, and this is about customers. It's not about administrative convenience. And we need to be ensuring that our customers have all the convenience they can, and in dealing really with what our official plan policies are about multimodal transportation and intertwining those. And with no evidence to suggest that there's any problem, I would say this Transit Commission needs to find a way to get to yes, not to no. You need to start by saying, let's allow this. Let's review it in a year. If there's a problem, we'll address it then. But the other thing in the report that disturbed me is the request to delegate authority for setting the times that bikes could be allowed on the trains to staff. That's a policy issue. You don't delegate policy decisions. You make the policy, and they come back if they want to change the policy. You might delegate some authority to make changes on special occasions like Canada Day or something like that. But a policy about when you're going to allow bikes on the train should be set by this Transit Commission, not by staff, and it shouldn't be delegated away to staff. So just to recap, I'm here to ask you not to reduce the service on the Trillium Line to the people that I represent, to get to yes, to allow as many people who want to take their bikes on the trains to do so, because we're here to encourage ridership, not discourage ridership. And every time you put an impediment in the way, you're discouraging ridership. So I'm hoping you're going to reverse this recommendation to say allow the bikes on trains, and if there's a problem, we'll address it when the problem arises. But to date, there has been no evidence of problems to suggest that you should do other than allow people who want to take their bicycles on the trains to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Leeper.
Thank you very much, Chair.
First, I do want to ask one question about the busking aspect of this report. Ottawa is in the process of creating a music strategy. Busking opportunities would be particularly interesting. We're working in close partnership with the Ottawa Music Industry Coalition. Will you be working with the OMIC in order to develop a busking schedule and framework?
Yes, we will, Mr. Chair. Staff have already been engaged with the other staff involved in that project.
Fantastic. I know they'll be excited about that. I want to turn to bikes on trains. A number of questions, and we've heard it from Councillor Deans, we've heard it from public delegations, with respect to the lack of data in this report, or the lack of any basis upon which we should be assuming that there's going to be a problem. Do we know how many people currently use rack and roll?
It's been quite a few years since we took any surveys. What we have done in the last 5-8 years is monitor for problems and respond to customer requests, but it's been quite some time since we took a survey or a census by operators or anyone else.
So we don't know how many.
We did that in the early years in order to inform the Transit Commission and Transit Committee at the time on whether it should be made a permanent feature of the service. Once we did that, we curtailed that work and redirected that staff effort to other tasks.
Just out of curiosity, was the last census or count of number of participants before or after the implementation of the Laurier bike lane?
Oh, it was many, many years before.
Okay, so we've obviously had a significant expansion of our segregated cycling infrastructure in the meantime. How many people on a train, if there were a cyclist who wanted to use that front door boarding, ride with their bike in the multi-purpose area, how many people would that displace?
Mr. Chair, I'm going to take you back to the picture here so we can see it in context. You can see the multi-purpose area there. This is an example. There's one person standing with a bicycle. You can see there would be room for two, possibly a third one beside them, but a third one there would really start to block that corridor. It's physically going to fit. You can see there's 4 flip-down seats against the wall, which if you're standing there with a large object like a bicycle or a big stroller, those flip-down seats might not be able to be used, or you can move the bike to one end and sit down. I'm going to guess that that person and that bicycle are taking the space of about, at busy times, perhaps 4, maybe 6 customers on the train. Obviously, that they count as one of the customers, so the question is, how much space is the bicycle itself taking up? And, you can sort of see that it would be in that range of 4, 3, that amount of floor space being taken up, or so that number of seats being taken out of service.
And if it displaced those 3 or 4 people, what is the total capacity of the train?
The total capacity of the train, we're designing the service for each train to carry 600 customers. At peak, we're designing it that way at peak times. When you look at an event like, Canada Day or everyone leaving all at once, there would be many more people than that. But a normal level of service, we're talking about 300 people in each of the 2 cars for 600 total.
So the cyclist would displace, 3 or 4 of those people who would need to wait for the next trip. How many people are we expecting are not going to be able to get on the train when it arrives on any given trip during peak?
That level of service will accommodate all customers who we expect to travel. As we've talked about before, we think it's likely that there will be more people returning to transit once the transitway construction is over. There may be more people coming to transit because of the quality of service that the O-Train provides. There might be more people coming to transit in the future because of the economic growth that can happen because of the investment in the O-Train. But those would all be matched by, over the longer period, those would all be matched by capacity increases. The question here is, what's it going to be like? How are people going to distribute themselves? What's the experience going to be on the first day, the first month, and the first year of operation of a brand new service for the people of Ottawa?
But I'm having a hard time understanding why we'd make an assumption that there was a problem such that we would begin with the going in position that we should prevent riders from being able to use the train, cyclists from using the train at peak. When we're talking about 3 or 4 riders who are going to be displaced by a bike, who probably are going to be able to get on the train anyways based on what you're telling me. Okay. During peak periods, I assume that the traffic will mimic current patterns in that outbound buses from the core are significantly fuller than inbound in the mornings, and then vice versa in the afternoon. It's asynchronous.
Well, outside of downtown, that's certainly true. Inside of downtown, we have people traveling in both directions. You know, there will be people when the O train opens, people traveling from the east to as far west, for instance, as Pimlico Station before they go to their workplace, from the west as far east as Ottawa or Lees. The busiest section is going to be those 5 stations in the middle, and that's it wouldn't be feasible to do what, for instance, GO Transit does, which is allow the bicycles on off-peak direction. You can say a train that's leaving downtown Toronto is definitely leaving downtown Toronto. Because we're an urban system, crossing over the flow, any sort of regulation that's about off-peak direction with this initial stage would be just, I wouldn't say meaningless, but very close to it. You know, a westbound, what is the off-peak stations on a westbound trip? People are still going to work up to Tunney's Pasture. People are joining the train downtown to go further west. We will see over time how people distribute themselves in the trains, and so we're recommending a cautious approach that doesn't, that prevents us from having conflict that might occur if things go badly for people.
A technical question. I do have a motion. I hope I have enough time from the chair. But the operator will have a view of what's going on in the train at all times. There's presumably some sort of video monitoring.
Yes, there is.
So the
yes,
operator will understand how full or not the train is.
The operator will have their primary task be the safe operation of the train.
Of course.
Monitoring for emergencies, but we'll always be able to look at those video cameras if there's a reason to.
Okay. And is there a technology employed in the train such that any given train can be barred to bikes or not, based on what the operator's seen in terms of the conditions on the train?
Not on the train. What we are imagining we would do in the case of a major outflow of passengers, my example is like the first half hour or the first 45 minutes, something like that, after the fireworks on Canada Day, that we would have supervisors at the entrances asking people with bicycles to consider cycling to where they're going or waiting until the large crush of passengers is over. But there's no technology on the train to provide that train-by-train information.
Chair, I have just 2 more questions, and I'd like to make a motion. Can I have your indulgence? Thanks. The security of bike parking is a big question. Can you describe the bike parking that will be provided and how secure it is, and how much of that would be inside the Fairgate area?
So there's 3 types of bicycle parking. We have 2 types right now. We're adding a 3rd on the system this year. The first is that we have open-air bicycle parking where people can lock their bikes to a post or a rack. We have some covered bicycle parking at a number of our stations now, where the bike racks are under a roof, and we are adding this year our first enclosed parking areas where people will be able to register and get a pass to open a locked sheltered area and leave their bicycle and as well as others inside this locked shelter. So those 3 forms exist across the network, but on the Trillium Line stations, on these 13 stations, there will be covered and open parking, and that's following the directions set by council when the design decisions were made for the Confederation line. And you'll also recall that council at that time directed staff to double the amount of bicycle parking in each one of the stations. So the enclosed parking that we'll be adding later on this year, the only Confederation line station where there's a feasible space to put that in at this time is at Saint Laurent station. We'll be looking for more possibilities after the property is turned over to us. Also, I can say that at all of the Confederation line stations, not universally true at all of our other stations, the bicycle parking is all under surveillance by CCTV cameras. So if there is any theft, vandalism, other sorts of damage, the CCTV can be used for investigative purposes and perhaps as a deterrence for those activities to take place in the first place.
Okay, because I do get periodic notes about bike theft from transit stations, and it seems to fluctuate up and down. Security is going to be really critical. We are proposing, or at least you're proposing, to bar bikes during peak. How will you make the determination that you no longer need to? What is that monitoring? What is the threshold? How many customers displaced would help you to make a recommendation that that ban could be lifted?
So as we note in the report, we would do that review after we've gone through a full year of operation, so we can see what the train experience is like for customers after all seasons of that year. See what it's like in the summer, see what it's like in the spring. We'll see how customers are managing themselves around other elements that are taken into the multi-purpose areas. See how full the first car of the train that around that first door is ending up being. If people choose to walk down the platform and distribute themselves evenly on the train, it would be more comfortable for everyone, but it will also be new. You know, a lot of places people just go on the first door they can find.
But if Mr. Swan, what I'm wondering is, do you have thresholds, a number that is data-driven, that is evidence-driven? This is all sounding very subjective.
I think it needs to be subjective by the nature of the work that you're looking for, whether there is space, whether there is not, whether there are problems at other times of the day that we need to manage, whether our information is getting through to people properly, whether they're having any trouble interpreting what we're asking them to do. I think by its nature it must be subjective because the nature of mass transit.
Okay, but it leaves open the possibility that we are going to continue a ban on the basis that 3 or 4 people per trip might be displaced, and we've said that's too many. Like, I'd like to know if there's a number. Is it 100 people who are having to wait, 200 people who are having to wait? There needs to be some basis upon which we can make that decision at some point in future. I'm actually going to propose that we make the best assumptions about how the system is going to work. I don't want to send the message to Ottawa residents that the train is going to be so jam-packed from day one that it cannot accommodate a couple of bicycles. Therefore, Mr. Chair, I'm making a motion this morning that whereas staff have recommended to Council that bicycles not be allowed on light rail during peak periods, and whereas the utility of LRT will be increased when it is incorporated into the multimodal trips made by residents, including to and from locations not in close proximity to an LRT station, and whereas it would be desirable to accommodate bicycles on the Confederation line and Trillium line to the maximum extent possible, including during peak times, therefore be it resolved that OC Transport permit bicycles on the Confederation and Trillium lines without time restrictions, subject to extraordinary demand management and the proposed restrictions on front door boarding and storing in the multi-purpose area only, and that the transit bylaw be amended accordingly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Leeper. Next on the list is Commissioner Milner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I assume we're going to have time to debate this motion later.
Well, technically, this motion takes precedence now because it's on the floor. So, if you want to come back to this motion in to get us
Okay,
in the
I'd prefer to ask some questions to staff first, if that's amenable to everyone at the table. First of all, I have some concerns along with Councillor Tierney on the animals and the definition of small, the definition of crate, and the definition of lap. I have a 75-pound dog who thinks he's a lap pet, and I would not necessarily want him on a bus. I also read in the report, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that this would make a change to all transportation, not just the train, that somebody would now be allowed to bring a small pet onto a bus. Is that correct?
That's correct. It would be for the complete transit system.
Okay. I would support Councillor Tierney in carving off that question if we can. The second concern I have is just regarding the trains all year round and the lack of data around this. Obviously, I think there's some questions around the table here about restricting and what, again, I wish I'd been able to see a little bit more detail as to what we consider on-peak here and what we consider off-peak. I don't see any mention, and again, I may have missed it, but any mention of special events. So what I'm thinking here is everybody biking to Blues Fest and then getting on the train on their way out because that's off-peak. I believe that Councillor Leeper's motion kind of deals with the extenuating circumstances that is super high peak scenarios. But I would be curious to know what staff deems as on-peak and off-peak is for reference in this report.
Our initial thoughts, Mr. Chair, is that we would post information like you can see here on this this example that says the bicycle boarding is permitted Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. and after 6 p.m. weekdays and holidays all day.
So if I'm reading that correctly, the bicycle boarding is not permitted between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. and before 9 a.m.? That would be the restriction?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I won't try and wordsmith that. And with regard to the number of bikes, what's the enforcement mechanism? I understand that, when we discussed the rollout of rail, that we're going to have added staff at train stations helping people get to their final destination, and I fully support that. I understand that that's probably going to be a limited time, that, a year or 2 years down the line, we're not going to have customer service staff directing people on how to enter and exit a train. I hope that people will have the common sense to be able to do that. What length of period are we looking at for that sort of added support and added cost? And do we have an end date?
Mr. Chair, we're planning to have customer service staff on the system at all times. We're planning to have supervisory staff on the system at all times. We're planning to have special constables on the system at all times, but they'll be working throughout the whole station. I imagine that the customer service staff will initially be spending much more of their time helping people with the fare system, with travel planning. The supervisory staff will be spending most of their time assisting operators to keep the trains running smoothly and safely, and special constables will primarily be dealing with security matters, safety matters, keeping the system safe for everybody.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have staff assigned to helping people to find their way to seats or to spaces on the train, neither in the short term nor the long term.
Okay. With regard to the stations, in my mind, I'm thinking Blair Station in Councillor Tierney's riding is a nice, easy station where I don't think train loading or disembarking is going to be an issue, whereas a station maybe like Rideau, we're going to see a little bit more of a congestion issue as far as stairs and bringing those bicycles out of the train platform and to the surface. What facilities have we built in beyond the elevators that will allow individuals, either in on-peak or off-peak, whatever the decision is, to bring their bikes to the surface?
So in addition to the elevators, and remember there's 2 elevators, so that if there's always an elevator, if one's down, the other one's working, and these elevators are large elevators. They're big enough for a couple of bicycles. They're big enough for a big powered wheelchair. In addition to that, every one of the stairwells has a trough, or what's called in the business a runnel, that allows people to put the wheels of the bicycle in that trough and roll it up or down as they walk up or down the stairs. We have one of those already for anyone who's used the walkway from Somerset down to the multi-use pathway on the east side of the O-Train Trillium line, so that it just allows that bicycle to be rolled, so it doesn't have to be hefted up on the shoulder. But of course, a lot of people are also ready to just sling it up on their shoulder and go where they need to go.
No, I hear that, and honestly, that's where my concern rises, is actually that the disembarking. I don't think I see a huge issue with the actual physical bikes on the trains. It's the getting them on and off, and that impact on other passengers. I'm envisioning a situation where somebody's huffing a bike over their shoulder and smacks somebody in the face on a stairway, and we're talking liability here. I guess my concern is that we don't have within this report a definite determination of what on-peak and off-peak is, and that concerns me. We don't have a definite determination as to what the enforcement mechanism, if we find somebody on a train that's empty during on-peak time, and how that's going to be enforced, and what that's going to take maybe our special constables away from. I don't see the level of detail that as far as statistics that others have mentioned, that I would hope to see to make a bit of an informed decision on this. You have in this report, a very, I think, a really thorough look at other jurisdictions. Has there been a situation in your research that shows a system that has changed from one to another, that say was all the time and changed to just off-peak, or vice versa for that matter? And did we find any evidence to why they would have done that?
The evidence, the experience we've seen mostly is that transit agencies have changed from banning bikes completely at all times to allowing them at times that they can. So, some of the closest examples in Canada, cities where bicycles were just not permitted on the transit system at all, and where in recent years they've found that they can open it up at off-peak times when the trains are less crowded. It's guided by their experience, as we imagine our choices could be too, guided by our actual experience once we see it happening.
Mr. Chair, I believe that my time is probably coming to a close, so I'll defer and I'll put myself back on the list if I don't mind.
Thanks very much. Councillor Eglai.
Thank you much, Mr. Chair. I want to start with the busker issue first. I noticed that your recommendation is that there be no fee, and on the accompanying chart, some places charge fees, some don't. What do we do in the rest of Ottawa? If you want to busk on the market, for example, or on Spark Street, do we charge a fee or don't we charge a fee for that? Do we know?
We do know that there is a fee paid in both the Byward Market and on Spark Street.
So I guess where I'm going here is sort of a fairness or consistency. If you want to busk in those areas, we're going to charge you for it, but if you want to busk in the LRT stations, we're not. So it seems to me that it should be one or the other. So I'm wondering how you came to the conclusion if we charge in other places in the city, we're not going to charge similar type performers in the LRT stations. Seems to me it should be about consistency and fairness.
Mr. Chair, I believe in both those occasions, those are administered by agencies other than the City of Ottawa.
Okay, maybe legal can help with this. I can see the sparks. I'm not sure why the Byward Market would be administered by somebody other than the City of Ottawa.
If I'm correct, that's now administered by that new Markets Corporation?
That's my understanding, Mr. Chair.
But previously the city administered and would have charged a fee, no?
Under the bylaw provisions, previously with the City of Ottawa, I understood there was a fee.
I just have a concern about the inconsistent way we're going to treat performers. So I don't know if that's something that can be looked at between now and when this comes to council, and some rationale as to why we are going to treat them different. But I would like to see that rationale, and I don't see it in the report. So maybe between now and council we could have that. The second piece, as I understand, it's sort of free-flowing at this point in terms of setting up a process, if you will, for auditioning and approving. I would hope part of that process would be, and if you're taking suggestions, I'd urge you to take this one, that it allows for rotation. So in other words, just because you've been approved once doesn't mean you have a permanent place in the LRT station. I think we should be able to provide as much opportunity as possible for area musicians, jugglers, whatever, fire eaters, whatever they might be, to sort of cycle through the system. So I'll leave that with you, but again, the report doesn't speak to it, but it seems to me that makes sense. Pets, I have no issue on the pets. I think that's reasonable. We already have pets in large part allowed on through companion or service animals. I think the size and the crate restrictions make sense. Let's talk a little bit about the biking issue. As I think it was Commissioner Milner pointed out, the report doesn't speak to a particular peak time. You've indicated that 6 to 9, 3 to 6. I've had the pleasure of riding our system at 6 in the morning on certain occasions to get to City Hall for early meetings. And that's not a dig at the system. It runs on time, but it doesn't seem to me it's hugely busy at that hour. And I'm wondering if staff would consider the possibility of maybe peak is 6:30 to 9 and starts at 3:30 to 6, and that allows a bit more flexibility for people that might be using the system. Whether that's something that you can consider, and again, that's something you could consider between now and when it comes back to council. But I think that might be a way to assist in some of the discussions we're having here. Can you give me a sense of how much time somebody has to get on and off the train at rush hour?
Mr. Chair, the amount of time that each train will spend stopped at a station will really be determined by the number of people who are boarding and alighting. If you look at a quiet station at a quiet time of the day, you might find that the doors are open or the train is stopped, ready for the doors to open for just a few seconds, possibly 10 seconds, possibly a little more. During rush hours, when the trains are stopped downtown at the busy stations, as we've all experienced when traveling to other cities, the doors are going to be open longer till everyone's off and everyone's back on, and you can imagine that being in the range of 30, 40 seconds. So
who controls that? Is that the driver? Is that can the passengers hold it back? I'm envisioning, building on what Commissioner Milner said, somebody's trying to get their bike out. I'm a pedestrian passenger, if you will. I get off the train to allow you to get your bike on, and I envision me standing on the platform as the train goes by because I didn't jump back on fast enough. So can we adjust for that sort of scenario?
Yes, we will, and both, to answer the question, both the customers and the operator control the doors. The customers by pressing a button to open the doors, but the operator to lock the doors by turning off the ability for the doors to be opened again.
It seems to me the common issue or the common complaint around here seems to be that there doesn't seem to be enough information in the report, especially around bike usage, which I think prompted Councillor Leeper to bring his motion, which suggests that we just let things happen all through the day with bikes and sort of see what happens. My concern with that approach is it does the same thing that the report does. It makes a recommendation without any substantive information behind it. A recommendation that's more pleasing to to Councillor Leeper, and I understand that, but logically it does the same thing. There's no independent evidence to suggest how many people are using the Rock and Roll, how many cyclists are overall, in order to support doing it the way that Councillor Leeper is suggesting as opposed to what the report is suggesting. So a couple of questions on that. So to legal, is there any impediment to the implementation of the bylaw if this was deferred for a month or two to allow OC Transpo to collect some metrics in that regard?
Chair, there's no legal impediment if you're focusing on the bike issue, whereas the rest of the report could be carried to capture the other elements.
So it seems to me the issue here is we're trying to make a decision without what most people around the table feel adequate information in front of us. I think one of the citizen delegations said fluff. I don't think it's fluff. I think staff do try and do the job as well as they can. But I think there's a consensus that we might need a little bit more meat on our plate so we can make this decision in a responsible and reasonable way. So what I was going to suggest is, or ask you, Mr. Scrimgeour, as an alternative to the approach suggested by Councillor Leeper, are you guys, is OC Transpo open to putting this report off for, say, 2 months to allow you to collect some data over the next month or 6 weeks about how many people are using Rock and Roll on a daily basis, how many of our bike parking areas are being used? I mean, in this sense, I guess the delay of the LRT is a bit of a blessing. It gives us some flexibility to look at this. Legal says there's no impediment in terms of is that something you're open to? Because if it is, I think what I'd like to do is move deferral of that portion of the report. I think I'm looking at the chair and the clerk. I think we can defer a portion of the report and pass the balance of it. So I'm suggesting we defer, I think it's recommendation number 2. So that would allow you to bring more information back to the table. Again, for the March or the April meeting, probably April, I would think. And that would allow us to have a more substantive discussion. And again, this, no offense to the motion of Councillor Leeper, it just seems to me from a logical perspective, he's trying to do what the report does, but with a different recommendation. There's still no foundation to what's being proposed. So I'm looking to you, Mr. Scrimgeour, as to whether you guys would be open to collecting some meaningful information on bike usage and cyclists, parking and that sort of thing, bring it back to us, and then allow us to make a more fact-based decision, if you will.
Mr. Chair, we're, of course, always in the hands of the Commission, but we would not support that recommendation. We would not support deferral. Our staff are fully engaged in preparing for the opening of the Confederation line. There is no reserve capacity to go and do additional research. We're happy to share all the information we have on we're happy to share the information we have with anyone who's interested in it. We're happy to have brief discussions about what that means. But we're really, really busy. We have hundreds and hundreds of tasks to do, and there is not reserved spare time in our staff. However, if Council were to make that decision, give us that direction, we would then work on finding what other work that we are doing would be the work that we could put off until another time.
Mr. Scrimgeour, there had been an earlier draft of a motion circulated that had a number of requests in it for information. If you look at that request for information, I think that's basically summarizes many of the questions councillors have had today. How long would it take to assemble that data and provide it by way of memo or well, I guess memo?
Chair, I'm not sure we all have that earlier draft.
Sure, we don't.
So maybe if we could see it, that might help us.
It was the draft motion from Councillor Leeper, which he didn't present, but current and historical use of Rock and Roll, projections of bike demand, feasibility of allowing counter to peak bike trips, I'm not sure what that means, the amount of space required for bikes and equivalent standing, which we have, projections for how many riders might be delayed if bikes are allowed, I think we got today, a proposed monitoring process and suggested thresholds for permitting or not permitting bikes.
And I guess what I'm saying, Chair, and I didn't know about this motion, but if Councillor Leeper was content with that, to take a deferral over what's on the table if those questions were answered, I would certainly move for deferral with direction related to the earlier draft. So I look to you, Councillor Leeper, if that's something you're comfortable with.
So the motion hasn't been put on the table, so I guess my question to staff was how quickly could the answers to those questions be assembled and provided to members of the Commission and to City Council?
At a guess from hearing that list, I would imagine that we have about half of that information now, and any of the onboard empirical research we could report back to you probably by the end of the year.
Sorry, by the end of the year?
Probably, yeah. We'd have to do that work during the summer and early fall.
Sure. And what is the okay, that's fair. Councillor Eggley, still...
Well, I'm not sure what I do with that because the train's going to open in November, as we understand it, and we either have to let bikes on or not let bikes on, and I think it would be difficult to let them do that for a month or 6 weeks and then have a report saying maybe they shouldn't be doing that. And again, I understand that you're very busy, but is there any way you could push that timeline up? And I guess the question really for OC at this point is how important is recommendation 2 to you? If it's significantly important, then hopefully you can find a way to squeeze out those resources to answer those questions in a way that we can address this before the train opens. And if not, then I think what will likely happen today is recommendation 2 will be unsuccessful. And again, what concerns me, it's equally based on little or no information. And that's what concerns me. So I turn it back to you, Mr. Scrimshaw, if there's any way you can think to achieve answers to those questions in a way that we can have an answer in time to have a position for when the train is supposed to open.
So again, Mr. Chair, we can answer about half of those questions, and I don't have the list, but we can answer about half of those questions with information that we have. Those questions that require counting the number of people who are using our current service, the current rack and roll, we could, of course, only begin to collect that information at the end of April once the racks are back on board the buses. I imagine that if we made a decision based only on information from May, that people would suggest that it wasn't indicative of year-round ridership when it gets warmer. So I imagine for that reason that most people would be more confident in the data if we had collected it in May, June, July, possibly. And then we'd be able to report back to the new council after...
I think it's important to remember that the recommendation is to come back in a year with data on how the service is actually functioning in real life. We're working on, and OC Transpo is currently working on best guesses, best assumptions, but we are asking our customers to go through a fairly dramatic change in service. If you get on the bus in Canada right now on an express, most people are getting the seat for most of the trip. Same thing for Orleans and Barrhaven and many other parts of the city. When the train starts service, most people, when the train is full, will be standing. There's 300 spaces on a train, 120 seats, 180 for standing. That's in and of itself a fairly dramatic change. I think if you actually want the data to make a data-based decision, and I think that's very smart to do, I think it's incumbent to give them the time to take the summer to put the data together to make a recommendation, and then also have November, December, January, February, March, April, etc., of the train actually being in service, understanding how many people are getting on, at what stations they're getting on, at what stations they're getting off, etc., actual real-life data to make an informed and educated decision. I think that's exactly what the report recommends. If there's a desire to delay it for a month for them to put whatever information together, I have no problem with that. But again, I think that information can be provided in a memo between now and council or what have you. But there's only so much information they have because people, in large measure, aren't riding their bikes right now.
No, and I do appreciate that, Chair. I guess my issue is, what do we go forward with, though, for the testing? Everybody on all the time, or with certain restrictions? And I guess that's what some of us are struggling with. And if I can ask for clarification on Councillor Leeper's motion. Councillor Leeper's motion doesn't speak to coming back. It simply speaks to allowing all the time. I don't know if the intention of your motion was that it be reviewed in a year as in the original recommendation or not.
It's not in there now, but I would be happy to accept that as a friendly amendment.
So that may be more palatable. I mean, this is a difficult one to decide, and I'm actually considering a Nussbaum abstention, even though we're not technically supposed to do that. It's a difficult one to go with. But Councillor Leeper, if you are prepared to amend your motion to allow the collection of data over that period of time and allow it to come back for discussion and review with this scenario, I'm willing to hear my colleagues, but it's something I'll certainly let percolate in that period of time. You would consider that a friendly amendment then?
I would.
Okay, thank you for that.
Commissioner Mallow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'd like to say that I agree with my colleague that this limitation appears to be inconsistent with the city's vision for a multi-node transportation system. Right? That's the general consensus around this table and out in the public. I also agree with our public delegation, that the report lacks information. Specifically, what is the problem? What is the problem? What is the risk that you're trying to manage by adding a rule that limits the full potential of this node? So knowing that this is inconsistent with the city's vision, staff nonetheless chose to come forward with this recommendation. So I'd like to give you this opportunity to tell us exactly what is the problem that we're trying to address. Like, what is the problem?
Mr. Chair, I would say that we are making this recommendation in order that the Commission can recommend to Council the adoption of a bylaw which permits bicycles to be carried on trains, which permits bicycles to be managed by staff at critical times. Currently, the bylaw is silent on this question, and it helps everyone if the bylaw is clear as to whether bicycles may or may not be carried onto trains. I would next say that our recommendation is a cautious approach to begin admitting bicycles onto trains at the times that the trains are going to be quieter, the times the trains are not going to be so fully loaded, where more people have a seat and there's more standing room available. And third, I would say that our recommendation is based on courtesy to our customers, taking their travel planning into account, so that in time, if Council's policy changes, we're providing more access to the system to our customers. We're providing them with more consideration, rather than starting from a point where we have the possibility that there will be conflict among passengers, the possibility that there will be crowding in trains, and then retrospectively coming to you with a recommendation to withdraw the ability for people to continue with an established travel pattern. So I would say that we're being respectful of Council's policy decisions, cautious in the implementation, the technical implementation of those general policies, and courteous to our customers to not disrupt existing travel patterns in some future date.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Mallow. Commissioner Kloot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, as a number of other councillors and commissioners, I have questions for staff, both on Councillor Leeper's motion as well as on the motion in the main. And as is often the case, it's always wise for me to either follow or to team up with Councillor Eglai, who expresses many of my thoughts. I agree with his view that what we're being asked is to make a decision one way or another on the basis of data that we simply don't have. And I know that we're living in the day and age of big data, but you've already indicated that we don't have current information on the number of people using Rack and Roll. And am I correct in my assumption that even if we had that information on how many people use it, say, on the bus going down Bank Street, it's not going to give us information on how many people are going to use it going across or use the bikes on trains going across the Confederation line? Wouldn't that be comparing apples and oranges?
I think I agree with the Commissioner. I would say that if we were to look specifically at how many people use the Rack and Roll feature between Tunney's Pasture and Blair stations on the rapid bus routes, we would get some indication of the starting number of people who would be using bicycles on trains. We certainly hope, with all the design decisions made by Council, the complementary decisions that have been made by Council about encouraging cycling, that we would far exceed the number of customers who now use the bike racks on buses. This is so much easier when the train's in place. We want this to be successful. This is a major design feature of how the designs are being made. So it would be a data point. It might be considered a floor of how many people might use it, but it should by no means be considered a prediction of how many people might use these features.
Okay, and then it seems to me, too, that we need to make this decision based on data that even if we gave you a year to get it, OC may be unable to provide. So I take it from your answers, you said that the capacity of the train is 600 passengers per train. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, that's not strictly speaking the capacity of the train. It's the level, it's what we call the service capacity standard. It's the level at which it's the calculation we use to plan the volume of service that allows for the fluctuation up and down by day of the week, by time of day, by individual trip, that allows the capacity is larger than that, but that's a comfortable number of people on the train.
Okay, and is it our anticipation that at peak times we may have a number of customers that may be approaching that number per train? That's information you likely do have.
Yes, apart from recent ridership changes for the last 2 or 3 years, that is the number of people who are traveling through downtown, of just over 10,000 people per hour, and that's what the capacity of the train is when it begins. So the trains will be at opening day or soon thereafter, right about that level.
And am I correct then in my assumption that we don't really have an accurate means right now of assessing how many people are going to want to bring bicycles onto trains on the Confederation line, until we've seen that happen for a year?
That's right, and that's why we're recommending that this be reviewed on the basis of actual experience with the O-Train in place.
Okay, so then turning the page on that, I'm wondering if the staff is open to a consideration of having a different rule for the existing Trillium line. You just mentioned that you would hate to be in a position of needing to withdraw an established travel pattern, and isn't that precisely what we're doing with respect to the Trillium line? It seems to me that the customers are used to using it as it is now, and you know that the Trillium line has different considerations that go with it. It is a different technology, and you know, understanding that Carleton is one of the major destinations for that, without making any assumptions of what a cyclist looks like, being a cyclist myself, I do observe that people that are students are more of an age and a fitness level and an economic level of their stage of their lives where they may be more likely to use it. So aren't we withdrawing an established travel pattern by saying that it has to be one size fits all, and would the staff be open to a consideration that maybe their final recommendation, if they are granted delegated authority, be to continue to permit it on Trillium Line until we know there's a problem, even if that's not the same rule for the Confederation Line. I mean, I know there's a messaging consideration there that we, want maybe one message, but there's a lot of marketing that's going to need to be done if we're withdrawing something that people on the Trillium Line are already enjoying.
So, Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, I can offer a few comments on that. I would say yes, if this recommendation were passed, yes, it would be withdrawing a current service that's available to customers, something that we are loath to do. I would suggest that there's not a difference, except in volume, between the nature of travel that's made on the Trillium Line and the nature of travel that will be made on the Confederation Line. One will be much busier than the other. Both are made using rail vehicles, which are quite full at busy times of the day. Both lines serve post-secondary institutions. Both lines serve major employment nodes. It's true that the technology is different. Some of the trains are red and diesel powered. Some of the trains are white and electrically powered. But I'd suggest it's very important that all customers are treated fairly and equally, that a single rule applies to the complete O-Train system, that we're not asking customers to know more details about the technical way we provide the system than they need to. And my final point, I slipped my mind, which was...
It just,
it was a good point, too.
I understand. It just seems to me that fairness, fair treatment doesn't always mean identical treatment. And it's a little bit more messaging. You said you're loath to have a two-different system, but earlier on you said you were also loath to withdraw an established travel pattern. That's precisely what we're doing with respect to the Trillium Line. And I take it from your comment that you anticipate one of the lines will be busier than the other. You're suspecting the Confederation Line will be busier than the Trillium Line, or vice versa?
I'm not suggesting that either one would be busier than the other. They're both designed at different volumes. The Trillium Line carries, in round numbers, 300 people every 12 minutes. The Confederation Line carries 600 people every 5 minutes, or more frequently than that. So they're at different scales. But the experience on the train, how crowded a square meter of space or the inside of a train is, will be very similar between what's rush hours now and what's rush hours on the second line.
It just seems to me that with the Trillium Line, we don't have a problem. And if the motion should pass, I would urge the staff to consider the possibility of treating, at least in that initial study period, the two lines differently. So to that end, there's been some questions of deferral. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what the effect of not passing delegated authority now would be.
So I have a note on that, Mr. Chair, and that is that the current bylaw reads, no person shall, in or upon transit property, ride a bicycle, unicycle, or tricycle. It does not say anything more than that.
Okay. And then I guess really the last is a question for the chair or for legal. But I guess one of the concerns about this is we're being asked to pass delegated authority, and then based on the experience of all seasons of the first year of operations, staff will come back and either make minor changes under delegated authority or major changes to the Transit Commission for consideration. It seems to me that after a year of operation, the Commission will have the data of what we should be doing, we should be allowing it or not. So I'm simply wondering, I don't know if there's a way to amend the report such to require, one way or another, staff to come back and allow the Commission to make a decision after a full year of operation. I should mention, too, that it seems to me the full year of operation is important. We can't say a year from now, because if we're opening in November, we don't want to come back in February and base a decision based on 3 months of winter usage. So I think that the time frame for a review is reasonable, but I just think that that should be a decision that the commission gets all of the year's worth of data about and then has an ability to make a decision at that time. So I guess my question is, can we pass delegated authority with a time limit on it? We'll wait for the chair, I suppose.
Chair, if I understand the question from Commissioner Crew, yes, we can do that. In essence, put a time limit on delegated authority.
So, then my recommendation, whatever I need to do it, would be that instead of having an open-ended with ongoing delegated authority, would be that staff do bring back a report after a year of operation and allow the commission to make a decision at that time, recognizing that it would be in the next term of council, and again, with my comments about allowing continued operation of the Trillium line, on which there's no problem in the interim.
Would you mind repeating that for me, Blair? I missed parts of that.
Yeah, so again, the tenor of what I'm suggesting is that we don't have the data that we need one way or another to make this decision now, and we have no way of getting it until such time that the line has been operating for a year. So my suggestion is, instead of having an open-ended delegation of authority, is to do whatever is required to require staff to bring back a report to the next commission after a year of operation, to allow the commission to make that decision at that time, as opposed to allowing further minor changes under delegated authority and major changes coming back to the commission. That's my comment or question, wondering how to propose that.
And you're moving a motion to that effect?
I would move a motion to that effect.
Okay, could you get it written up just so that you can circulate and people can read it, please? And then at some point, we're going to continue, but at some point we might take a little break just so the clerk's office could sort out the email, because there's a bunch now, and we can put them in the right order to move forward with. Next on the list is Councillor Nussbaum.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a number of questions to staff first before maybe some observations on the motions. In the report, staff researched bicycle policies at 17 North American transit agencies, and a majority permit bicycles at peak periods. A majority. I'm curious whether, as part of the research, you got a sense from the majority who do permit bicycles at peak periods why it was that they allowed that, what the experience was. Were there any numbers that staff were able to get in terms of a percentage of riders that were using bikes? That would be a particularly interesting statistic.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'm afraid we don't have any of that information.
Okay, and then so in terms of those 9 agencies that do permit, including New York, I noted, which is the largest transit agency in North America, did we get any anecdotal experience about whether they had made a change? That was, someone else asked a similar question, but do we know of any of the 9 agencies that permit bicycles at peak periods, whether they went from not permitting to permitting, and whether they experienced any problems with that?
Mr. Chair, we have that information for some of the transit agencies, not all. The transit agencies who previously did not permit bicycles on the system and changed their policy so they would. We don't have any examples of policy decisions being made the other way to withdraw access.
Okay. My next question relates to modeling. A number of colleagues have asked about current numbers of rack and roll. I'm curious whether in the preparation of this report there was any work on modeling anticipated percentage uses of transit users bringing bicycles. Do we have any sense of what we're anticipating in terms of what that usage would be?
Mr. Chair, we have, of course, as we've been discussing earlier, limited ability to predict the behavior of individual groups of customers. What we took as an example was our experience on the existing O-Train Trillium Line, Line 2, which is that there's about an average of one bicycle per trip. That's one out of maybe 300, 250 people. When you escalate that up to a train that's twice as big, maybe we would see two people on each, two out of every 600 people. So that's a number that we know we can initially manage within the one multi-purpose area at the front of each train, and really that's as far as we can go until we see how customers on foot distribute themselves within the cars, and how interested customers with bicycles are in hopping the train for some of the shorter distances that this train will operate in its first phase. I will say that one of the things that helps us a lot here is we're starting with a line that is 12, 13 kilometers long. We should have, and we will have, lots of good experience for any policy decision that's needed by the time the trains go all the way from Baseline and Moody all the way to Trim and all the way from Bayview to Riverside South.
Thank you. So if 2 of 600 is a reasonable approximation or model, back to the slides that you were showing earlier, can 2 bicycles fit in the multi-purpose area in that front door, the front portion of the train?
Yes.
Okay. And just to clarify some of the answers to your previous questions, so in the modeling for, let's say, the first year of operation, you talked about the capacity of a 2-car train being roughly 600 passengers. Are we anticipating at peak times that there will be a particular station where people will not be able to get on the first train, but they'll have to wait at the platform for a second train?
Mr. Chair, not under normal conditions. One of the design conditions that the city set for the design-build contractor, RTG, is that they need to demonstrate to us that passenger flows are accommodated, that trains will move all customers away, that there's no bottlenecks in the stations. That's under normal conditions. I would say that if there's an unusual event occurs, like there's let's say there's an ill passenger and there's a 8-minute gap in service from one train to the next, that first train that comes along after that gap is going to be very, very busy. And if it's an eastbound train, maybe it will fill up at Parliament and won't be able to pick up too many more customers at Rideau. But under normal conditions, everyone will be able to get onto the first train that comes.
Okay, and if we fast forward 20 or 30 or 40 years, and hopefully in a world of much higher ridership, the increased ridership will be accommodated at peak periods through adding a third train or through more frequent service?
More frequent service.
Okay, great, thank you. So moving to the area of peak times, and you noted in the draft report that the idea would be, or the staff recommendation is to limit bicycles from 6 to 9 in the morning, from 3 to 6 in the afternoon. And I've heard a few people wonder if those numbers could be adjusted. I did a brief survey myself and noticed that other cities have more limited rush hour or peak hour times. Edmonton 7:30 to 9, 4 to 5:30. Vancouver 7 to 9, 4 to 6. And interesting to Commissioner Crew's point, Vancouver has very specific instructions about the ability to ride in a counterflow direction. They have specific direction on allowing trains on certain lines at all times and on other lanes depending on flow. So I'm curious whether staff had contemplated either option of differentiating the line in the recommendation or looking at counterflow and more limited exclusion periods.
There's a lot of these comments go back to my earlier statement that we're recommending a cautious approach in the early early years of the O-Train Confederation Line operation. The first is about, we talked earlier about the nature, the possibility of distinguishing off-peak direction from peak direction. I think that is possible from Herdman to Blair. I think that's difficult in the section of our line between Herdman and Tiny's Pasture to define what is the off-peak direction. Vancouver has a different geography than Ottawa, Vancouver. One of the characteristics of the rapid transit lines in Vancouver is that downtown is at one end of the line, of each of the lines. Well, except for the one that doesn't go into downtown. But the Expo line and the Canada line both terminate in downtown. And if you're going away from downtown, you're clearly in the off-peak direction. There's still a lot of people traveling. But Ottawa, being a city that's oriented east-west, all of our transportation arteries pass through downtown rather than ending in downtown, except for the north-south ones, of course. What was the other point? I'm sorry. I'm afraid
a more restricted peak hour period.
Yeah. So one of the things that's different about Ottawa than other cities is the number of people who work early hours, the number of people who go home shortly after 3 o'clock. We used to have, when I first came to Ottawa, there was rush hour would be over by 5:30. There were so many people leaving at 3 and 3:30. That's not true anymore, especially not on the highways where you see rush hour continuing well after 6 o'clock now. So trimming it down in the afternoon, if there's going to be a distinction, if there's going to be a restriction, I'd suggest that 3 o'clock's a good time to start it, 6 o'clock's a good time to end it. For the morning, 9 o'clock's a good time to end. You could possibly end it a little earlier, but not 8, because you're still in the middle of rush hour. And the other question is, do you try to explain to customers that there's 3 time periods during which they can use trains, put the bikes on the trains, or do you try to simplify it, go to the nearest hour so that those messages are clear and those messages are memorable? And maybe there's not that many people before 7 a.m., but then we would have to tell people, all right, it's 5 to 7, 9 to 3, and 6 till end of service. And it's just more information to ask people to hold in their heads when they're conducting themselves.
Okay. Thank you for answering those questions. I guess just a brief comment on the motions that are before us. I think Councillor Eglai said it well when he said that it would be great if we could make this decision on somewhat more exact data and a better sense of the evidence and the modeling. It doesn't sound like we're going to be in a position to be able to do that. I asked those questions because I wanted to get a sense of what some of that modeling could be, and I think we got a very helpful statistic from Mr. Scrimgeour, which is, and I'm not holding you to this, but the idea of 2 of 600, is that a reasonable approximation based on the Trillium Line experience? And in light of the fact that staff are not anticipating that passengers at platforms are going to have to wait for more than a train, and in light of the fact that we have room for 2 bicycles on each train, I think Councillor Leeper's motion with the friendly amendment from Councillor Eglai of saying, well, let's see how it goes. Our expectation is it should go well, and if it doesn't, of course, we would want staff to come back and let us know. So, I think on the basis of that, on the basis of the stats that a majority of North American transit agencies are permitting bicycle usage at peak periods, apparently without any adverse impact, and further to the idea that I think we want to be a welcoming transit agency. We want the ridership bump. We want to include and invite as many users as possible. I'm inclined to vote in favor of Councillor Leeper's motion with the recognition that we're not in an ideal situation, but if we're going to err on the side of let's give it a shot or let's be restrictive, I think giving it a shot while giving staff the delegated authority to deal with special situations makes a lot of sense to me. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Cloutier is not here. Commissioner Mantilla Hartman, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like Commissioner Crew, I'm a little concerned based on something that you had said earlier that we don't want to be pulling back service, yet we're talking about doing that on the Trillium Line. But we'll get back to that in a minute. First question, there was a mention made that there was one station where the bicycle area is in the wrong section of the station, or not the wrong section, but not the ideal section of the station. What station is that?
Mr. Chair, the eastbound platform at Bayview Station has an entrance from Scott Street, which is immediately at the east end of the platform. Sorry, that's from Albert Street, not Scott Street.
Would it be fair to assume that most of your concerns for, the numbers we're talking about on the physical trains just aren't very high. Like, we're talking impact of 2 to 4 people per 600. That's not a huge impact on the trains. Is it more of a concern of the downtown stations? I'm wondering if this is a congestion issue around the underground stations that you're concerned about with bicycles at the peak hours.
Mr. Chair, no, we're not concerned about that.
Okay, so if a restriction was just placed on the underground stations, that wouldn't alleviate your...
I think I would say, again, that our recommendation is based on the idea that you want to introduce new features to people as you can and as you're confident that you can. We're by no means concerned. We're just recommending caution.
Okay. I'm going to recommend a little caution too, and that is that if we do go ahead with the restrictions on the new Confederation line, that the Trillium line not be part of that, because I don't like the idea of us pulling a service that is currently available back. Most of this back and forth has already happened with Commissioner Crew, so we need to go over it again, but I do have a motion that I'll be looking to put forward that removes the Trillium line from that recommendation.
Did you actually introduce your motion? Could you read it out?
Certainly. That recommendation 1A, to provide the general manager to permit and regulate the carriage of bicycles on board transit vehicles and in stations, be amended such that bicycles continue to be permitted at all times on the Trillium line.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We'll add that to the sorting. Do you have any other questions or comments? Okay. Councillor Wilkinson.
I first have a question about the animals. I read what's in the actual bylaw. It doesn't say anything about size. It doesn't say it has to be on their lap. You could have a huge crate if you can get it on the bus. Under this one, it just says that they have to be an enclosed handheld container, such as handheld, strong people can hold a lot, along the carrier crate that is secured at all times, such that the animal does not, etc., etc. It doesn't have anything to do with size. It doesn't say it has to be on their lap, which we've been told all along that it be held on their lap. And so if they take another seat for it, that's a different problem. So I'm just wondering if this shouldn't be a little bit more specific. You've left it wide open, actually.
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to ask my colleagues from Legal Services to give a view on whether additional restrictions should be hard-coded into the bylaw or left to be the other conditions as may be imposed by the director.
Mr. Chair, it's obviously subject to Commission and Council's will, but the provision relating to animals does create a regulation and an offense provision if someone were to contravene that, which would be if someone were to transport an animal that was not in an enclosed container and that was not secure at all times, that would be a contravention of the bylaw. Whether or not there is a requirement for greater specifics on the provision, I leave that to, obviously, Commission and Council. But as the proposed wording is now, that does create a regulation and an offense under the bylaw should it be contravened.
So somebody can carry in a Great Dane in a crate, and that would be okay? I couldn't, but some people could.
Mr. Chair, to the Councillor's inquiry, the report does reference a crate or container that would be put on someone's lap. Whether or not that specific reference would be made in the provision, that could be made should Commission and Council desire.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chair, that would be better because the bylaw doesn't say anything. It doesn't have any restrictions at all, except that they're in an enclosure. And it does say that is then it enclosed. It says handheld container, but you can interpret that you can hold the container up without the animal in it. So I don't know. I just think there should be something in there. Can I leave it to staff to do this before they take a look at the wording of the bylaw itself and put something like that can be held on the lap? Because if there's an empty seat, putting it beside them is one thing. If there isn't, we want to have that seat available.
So, Mr. Chair, I think if you can give us direction that the will of the Commission is to impose a size limit, we can work with legal services to draft a small amendment which somebody could propose at the time of consideration at Council. Alternatively, you could direct us as staff to make those the restrictions that are listed there in 1 to subject to any other conditions as may be imposed by the Director. If you gave us direction to impose a size restriction and make that the...
I'm quite happy with that. I think it is. I
we would do that.
We can't have it completely open-ended because we're going to start getting problems, and then the problems come back to haunt us a bit, usually.
Mr. Chair, I would add that the transit bylaw currently does have a prohibition of persons bringing large, bulky objects that would block an aisle on a transit vehicle. So that may address the concerns where someone were to bring a large container that may cause problems for other transit users. I just wanted to point that provision out that is currently in the bylaw.
I'm not sure an animal would be a bulk. It's living. Anyway, I'm quite happy if the staff are willing to do that, or that's okay with the Commission. It's just when reading the second one on the bicycles, the actual bylaw says no person shall bring a bicycle on board a transit vehicle except as permitted by the Director. It's really open-ended. I think what we're doing today is trying to make it a little bit more specific. I support Councillor Leifer's notion. I think we should have it for a year. You can't have no bike on there for a year and do an evaluation to see how many would have been there because nobody's there. No, the report recommends no bikes at all on the.
No, the report recommends bikes at all times of day except rush hour.
I know, but I want them on rush hour because I have people in my area, and we have not the easiest transportation system, as you very well know, that take the bike to the bus in the morning, and then the rack and roller on and go all the way into past downtown or someplace. I'm not sure. They don't work downtown. So they have to have the bike at the other end to get from the bus to where they work. And Ottawa is getting a lot of decentralization of jobs, so more and more people are doing that. In the summertime, we see them. And I think it's really important that they be able to get to and from work. We have a policy of trying to encourage people to use other forms of transportation, such as transit, cycling, and pedestrians. And we're actually saying you could be a cyclist to the start of your route, but not from there on. I don't know how many people are involved, and I think none of us do. And I think you can have some restrictions on how many can go in each train. As I remember when we first started looking at the LRT 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, a long time ago anyway, that they actually had pictures showing how somebody downtown could get into an elevator and get down to put the bike on the train. And I don't think we are not told it was going to be only not when they're going to and from work. And so I think we do need to have this motion passed, and I agree with the addition that it be reviewed after a year because it's something that you need to have that information. And if there is a problem, there is a provision in there that under extraordinary conditions, the staff can make some rulings on it and then bring that back and inform us. And I don't have a problem giving them that direction, but to say no right from the beginning, I've had people contact me already. They say, how am I going to get to work? And that's not what our objective is on using transit and trying to get more people to use transit. So I would suggest that we make that change now, not postpone it, so people know what's coming, then keep a very close eye on it. Fortunately, we're now opening up at the end of November. The number of bikes going on at that time of year is probably not going to be very large. So we'll have time for people to adjust to the new system before we start getting bikes going on as well. And the bikes take up less space than a heck of a lot of the strollers that I see on there and other things. We make provision for animals and for strollers and for everything else. But I think we have to take a look at the alternative transportation modes as well and to just say no. I mean, if you get on, if you're going to a university, you can get on and get all the way without having to take your bike with you. But if you're going anywhere else, you can't. Not coming from the West End. And a lot of people are coming from the West End because that's all Barrhaven, all of Canada, all of Stittsville, all of that, and the West End of Ottawa. It's a huge number of people. And I think we've encouraged the bicycles cycling so much. I do get complaints from drivers now that they don't have room to drive their car anymore, but just to stop it. So that was my suggestion, is that we support this motion now, give it a year, or 8 months, or whatever it takes to get the proper reading on how many are using it, which means it has to be over a summer, and then see how it works out. And I don't have a problem with having a limit on how many on a train, if that's the way that has to happen at rush hour. They were actually told at one point, I think, that might happen. They have to wait for the next one, just like they wait for the next bus when they don't have a rack and roll on it. So those are the issues that I have, Mr. Chair.
Thanks very much, Councillor. Councillor Chernyshchenko, if you can find a microphone.
Thank you very much. It has been a very useful discussion, and I guess by coming pretty near last, batting last, I get to clean up or perhaps try and find clarity through all of the discussion, all of the questions so far. First thing I want to say is I totally understand where our OC staff are coming from, and I mean this in the nicest possible way. We are a town where caution is our default, and we are doing something new, and there are so many new things and unknowns about the opening that I do understand where the motivation and perhaps even the direction to be cautious may have come from. But that being said, I'm actually going to recommend the opposite. And I don't believe that I'm doing so on a wing and a prayer. I think the little bit of data that we do have indicates that we may actually be imagining a problem that isn't going to be a problem. When I hear that we have approximately 2 bicycles going onto rack and roll buses, the equivalent of perhaps 2 bicycles on a 600-person train, and knowing the limited amount of space that would actually take, and that it might only be a problem at the very most peak of peak hours. What this says to me is we may find that we never have a problem, and if we do have one, we have the ability then to control it as precisely as the most focused a way as possible. So the conclusion that I've reached is actually that we should open the system with no limitations other than the particular carriage and door to enter and the space, but no limitation on hours. I do not also believe that we should be limiting this to the Trillium line only, because the end result we're going to have there is feel free to come on the train with your bike. Now you're at Bayview, wherever your transit point is. Now you're out of luck. Lock your bike up or ride in what actually might be a trip where they're going out to Canada or they're going to Trim Road, in the end. And so that would in the end introduce a restriction. I think what we would find is that, especially with the soft launch of a November date, is we're going to have the gradual introduction of people bringing bikes on the train, and we have the ability in, let's say, May or June, if a problem arises, a problem that is measured in numbers, measurable numbers of bikes, hopefully not, but measurable numbers of complaints, that we can react quite quickly to that. We don't need a year of it being a problem to then change the rules. We can actually implement it and say, well, it's been a bad couple of days. We can respond to that and then ratchet back to, okay, let's limit it to the most peak hours and then see how that goes. And the reason I'm recommending this ultimately is that's a true science experiment. That is measurable data. The problem with doing the opposite is that we will not have people, there will be no one to count. we will effectively have said you can't ride the train with your bicycle during these hours, therefore we can't count you. And unless you made the point of going online each day and registering your complaint, I would have liked to have ridden the train with my bike today, but I didn't, please count me. We're actually going to be no further ahead after a year than an anecdotal survey of the city saying, are you annoyed that you didn't get to ride bring your bike on the train, as opposed to actual measurements. So I believe that approach is not only the most logical one in terms of data collection, but is a sensible one, and to be fair, I think a relatively cautious one. We have that ability, as I've already said now, to do a kind of a soft launch and to adapt as necessary. So for that reason, I'm recommending the opposite approach, and I guess at this point supporting Councillor Leeper's motion, but without any restrictions initially, but the delegated authority to our own staff to be able to respond quickly if a problem arises. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Commissioner Mallow, I had you down again, but that might be my error. Did you want to go again? Yeah. No? Okay. Councillor McKinney.
Thank you, Chair. First question is around consultation. Can you tell me who all was consulted on the report with respect to not allowing bikes on LRT during peak periods, and what the feedback was from that, and who was it that was consulted?
Mr. Chair, I would say that we're informed by ongoing discussions with the cycling community, such as Bike Ottawa. We know that from many meetings for them, they are in support of a multimodal future, that as we're recommending that bicycles be allowed onto trains, and that of course the system has been designed for that purpose. The recommendation to start with a restrained, modest, cautious approach is a staff recommendation, and it's brought here to you for your consideration.
So essentially no direct consultation on how we should operate our light rail system with respect to multimodal trips when we open it up. So Bike Ottawa, we heard here today, are out and have some concerns. I certainly do. I'm surprised that we're even here talking about a cap on ridership when we, year over year, we've seen ridership decrease, and we're spending billions of dollars on a light rail system, and before it's open, we're considering capping it. Again, doing a review after a year, after 60 days, after any time doesn't make sense. You can't review something that hasn't happened. It would be like, saying I'm going to not feed my kid chocolate for a year and then see how he or she reacts to chocolate. So that doesn't make sense. We either are going to be bold and do what we can to increase ridership and to allow multimodal use on all of our light rail, and to pull apart Trillium versus Confederation as well. Is just again that I know it's been thrown out, but it again just doesn't make sense in terms of, first off, what would you do when you got to Bayview Station, and second, if you look at counter peak, and if you live in the downtown, according to this recommendation, you live in the downtown, you work at the Ottawa Hospital, and you start work at 7 a.m., you have no way of getting there if you want to take your bike, unless you are okay with putting your bike at an unsecured rack somewhere. So is that, I'm just not sure what the rationale is for not allowing somebody with a bike onto an essentially empty train going counter peak. Is there, if you could just explain that rationale?
I think, Mr. Chair, I have nothing to add from what I said earlier, summarizing it, that the staff recommendation is for a cautious approach to make that decision after we have seen how customers behave, customers distribute themselves on the trains. I don't think there's anything more I can say. Of course, as the Transportation Services Department is fully in support of cycling, walking, in addition to transit, as the modes we want to encourage across all of the city. Our staff recommendation is only to take those cautious steps one at a time.
So, do you have any confidence in the fact that a train going from Tunney's to Canada would not be full between 6 and 9 p.m. based on what's happening, from the downtown today to Tunney's? Would that train going in the opposite direction not have less capacity just based on what we know around ridership?
Absolutely. During rush hours, Mr. Chair, a train that has started at Blair will almost always have the most number of people on board that train as it leaves Herdman Station. It will have picked up people at Blair, Cyrville, Saint Laurent, pick up more, maybe a few at Tremblay. It'll pick up more people at Herdman, and then it will start dropping people off at U Ottawa, Rideau, Parliament, Lyon, Pimsey, with a few others, some downtown residents joining the train to go west if they're going towards Carleton University, if they're going to Tenny's Pasture. There'll definitely be fewer people on the train once it's west of, let's say, Lyon, because the balance will start to go the other way. But at that point, we're down to 2 stops left on the train.
But going south, then, once you get to Bayview and you're going south, say, between 6 and 9 a.m.,
on the Trillium line?
Yeah, on the Trillium.
It's early in the morning. It's not terribly high. As you get closer to 9 o'clock, you're hitting the time that a lot of people are traveling to Carleton University, and that's, I'm not sure exactly, but it's probably 8:30 to 10:30 is the busiest time in both directions on the Trillium line.
The photo that we see up here, is that an Ottawa train?
That's our mock-up, the one that was on display a couple of years ago at Lansdowne Park. That is our mock-up, delivered by the manufacturer, and it's an exact replica of the conditions with some tiny technical changes that we made after we saw the mock-up. But it's exactly how the doors are laid out, the seats are laid out. We've made some small improvements to where some of the overhead grab bars are located.
So I might have missed this earlier because I had to leave and come back. So on that first train, when you enter the first door, what is the capacity for bikes? How many bikes would you be able to put onto that first train?
We talked earlier about, in that multipurpose area, which you can see marked by the darker floor covering, easily 2 bicycles, perhaps 3, but you get 3, you're starting to, you might be in a place where it's hard to hold on, or you're blocking the aisle. It might be that a third customer with a bike might not feel they're ready for it like the first 2.
So just so I'm clear then, we're talking about 2, maybe 3 bikes per train period that we're limiting? Is that right?
Where that lines up in 2 ways. That's consistent with the use we see right now on Line 2, on the Trillium line. So on Line 1, the Confederation line, about the same ratios. The trains are a little more than twice as big. Maybe we'll see twice as many people from the 1 going to a 2. And second, the recommendation that we're making, the procedure we're explaining here, where people will be asked to get on through the front door and use the first multipurpose area. We'll encourage customers with disabilities, strollers, luggage, to use the other ones further back. That matches up nicely. If over time we found that we were consistently carrying 4 bicycles per train, we would then have to find what's the best way of explaining that to people. Is it use the first 3 doors of the train, or is it use the first door and the last door? And that's when we do another piece of work and see what other cities around the world are doing.
And that's good. I guess though what I'm asking is, what capacity are we opening up? Like, is that it? So we're opening up enough for 1, maybe 2 strollers, maybe 3 people by limiting bikes?
So the recommendation is to allow bicycles on through the first door of the train.
Yeah.
That will provide room for 2, maybe 3 bicycles per train, and these trains are running frequently. That leaves the other 7 multi-purpose areas available. So someone with a disability, someone with a stroller, someone with luggage. Let's think mostly of people with disabilities who are using devices like wheelchairs, don't need to position themselves at a strategic point on the platform. They can just get on through any door that's convenient to them.
No, and I agree with that. I guess my question is, by limiting bikes and putting people out who cycle to work or to cycle around and use light rail, by limiting that during peak periods, we're opening up capacity for maybe 2, maybe 3 more riders?
That's along the lines of the estimate I gave earlier to one of the other councillors. I think I did a visual math and said that not allowing bicycles in that space might allow room for 4 to 6 more people to ride on the train.
So we're going to limit one mode of transportation for maybe 4 to 6. It seems like not a good trade-off, but I certainly hope that we won't go forward with that recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Commissioner Milner.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple questions, because we're presuming, based off of this, that all of the trains at peak periods are always going to be full. And I wonder, is that an assumption that we're holding through our various parts, including our ridership numbers that we projected for revenue? Are we expecting 600 every 3 to 5 minutes through peak periods on all of these trains?
Through the busiest 60-minute period of the morning, the busiest 60-minute period of the afternoon, yes. That's how we calculated the number of trains we recommended that Council buy.
Okay, and that's fair. I just want to make sure that we're holding this information across reports and across decisions instead of looking at them kind of in silos. My second question, and I actually don't think you're going to be able to answer it, but maybe it's a call to my colleagues who are actually on council, that we actually look at transportation numbers. I think we probably have a fair understanding of what the number is of cars on Laurier at 5 o'clock, but do we know how many bikes are on Laurier at 5 o'clock and how many people are on buses on Laurier at 5 o'clock? We need to be able to look at these not with blinders on it. And back to my previous comments, I do feel that we don't have it. My deference is towards statistics and ensuring that we're making decisions that are based off of it. I think that Councillor Eglai's previous friendly amendment, I think, will allow us to at least have a bit, and Councillor Wilkinson as well, a bit more information and be working from a spot where we are tracking complaints versus mysterious complaints. I've listened on with interest on this debate because I do think that this is an important issue, and I think that it is difficult to go back and change these decisions once people have been made. And the conversation that we're having around the line 1 versus line 2 is a classic example of this. We made a decision as a commission, not a commission that I sat on, but a commission that some others here probably sat on, to allow bikes on line what will now become line 2. And I think that decision should have a look towards the future. So as we sit here, we need to make sure that we see LRT stage 2 and 3 and ensure that this decision is one that can be justified in the future as well. I thank staff for their work on this. I don't think that this is an easy cut or white or black decision, and I'm cognizant of the security and the personal security and the issues around individuals' clothing, for example, of getting dirty on their way in to work. And I think that there are justifications on both sides. I just want to thank staff for their work on this, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Milner. Councillor Eglai.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll keep this brief. Councillor Leeper and I, in a brief and rare occurrence of detente, have come up with another amendment to the motion. It came from discussions with himself and Commissioner Milner. The opening of the line is going to be a fairly intensive and time. It's going to be a lot of interest, probably higher ridership to start. So the suggestion that we have come up with to amend the motion further in a friendly way is that the bikes on the train at all times be deferred for 60 days. Keeping in mind if the opening of the train is supposed to be late November, there wouldn't be that many people doing it. The rack and roll wouldn't be in operation at the time, but it allows a bit of more of an ease-in period. Still will allow staff to pick up the important data through the around rack and roll and everything else in the higher usage periods of spring and summer. So that's, if everybody's okay with that, Councillor Leeper and I have talked about that we would defer the all bikes on all trains at all times by 60 days from the opening of the line. Keeping in mind, however, and I look to staff as to how we might word this, but I'm cognizant of the comments that have been made about not having a two-tiered system. The people on the Trillium line already have the ability, as I understand it, to have so I wouldn't want to see a change in that, but just in the new line for that first 60 days. And again, I look to staff. I'm looking back here at legal and clerks as to how that might be worded.
2 months.
And again, essentially, this is a period where there would not be a lot of bike usage in any event, but it allows an ease-in period. So I'll leave that to staff to provide us with the wording, and then, again, Councillor Leeper and I are on the same page. It doesn't happen often, but we're on the same page on this one, and want to get the best information we can have in order to make an evidence-based decision. So I thank Councillor Leeper for introducing this motion and allowing it to be modified.
Okay, so someone over at that table is working on that language. I'm looking at Taffy and whomever. Okay. Mr. Scrimgeour, can you comment on that particular element?
As always, we'll follow the decisions of Commission and Council. I would say that a decision like this that makes the experience tentative on a future outcome will make it difficult for us to provide the best, clearest information to customers on what they can expect. If we have, we can do the best job of explaining what customers should do if we have clarity from Council on whether bikes are accepted at all times or only at limited times, and that whichever of those two is chosen, if we can have that clarity, will allow us to build all of our customer information, all of the, it's like there's going to be a user's manual learning experience to people coming into this system for the first time, people who haven't traveled, or people who haven't used a rapid transit system every day, a rail rapid transit system every day in their experience. So if we have a feature of the system which is still tentative as we introduce the system to people, that will be a weak point in our communication. And that would be a shame, but we would have to make up for that in other ways and explain this is what we're trying, and it's a test for now. And it softens up the clarity that we'd like to give customers as we introduce them to their new O-Train line.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Scrimgeour. Keith, or Councillor Aguilar, you're good? Okay, Councillor Nussbaum. I had a question. Just ask it. We're going to take a break before.
Okay, well, it's a quick question to Councillor Aguilar. I mean, I appreciate the thought process that went into a transition period. I mean, I understand it, but in light of the staff response, I guess there's a concern that might create a little bit more confusion than less. But recognizing that you had good intentions, would you be prepared to not put forward that amendment in light of the staff response and still support Councillor Leeper's motion?
Thanks for the recognition. And I think Mr. Scrimgeour did make a good point that it would be sent out a number of different messages Again, taking into account that we're likely going to open in November, early December, and the bike traffic is likely going to be not all that significant at that time. Yeah, I can, as long as we go with the original amendment, then I can support it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions, comments? Okay, seeing none. Yeah, so we're actually going to take a break because it's lunch hour as it happens to. So we're going to take a break and let staff put them in the proper order, and everyone can come back. I have some things to say before that, though. Often during the cycling debates in Ottawa, cities such as Copenhagen and Amsterdam are referenced as models that Ottawa should be following. In fact, there is an index called the Copenhagen Bicycle-Friendly Index of worldwide cities that are considered bicycle-friendly. It's featured in Wired magazine, and it's a biannual index that started in 2011. In 2015, Wired magazine wrote, in Denmark and in the Netherlands, a set of rules has evolved over a century, tried and tested and proven to work. It's established with best practice, and it's a model for cities everywhere. I absolutely agree. And it's interesting to note that both in Amsterdam and in Copenhagen, bicycles are not permitted on their metros, on their subways, or on their buses during rush hour. And I'll quote for a second from their websites. On the Copenhagen Transit System website, you can buy a ticket for your bicycle. They actually charge you more to take your bike onto the metro. A bicycle ticket is valid for 2 hours in all zones. During rush hour, which they classify as 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., and from 3:30 in the afternoon to 5:30 in the afternoon, bicycles are not allowed. If you travel with a bicycle during rush hour, you'll be fined and asked to leave the train. In Amsterdam, bicycles also need to purchase a ticket and pay more to take your bike on the train, and if you ride without such a ticket, you risk a fine. If you have a foldable bike, however, you don't need to pay. And they suggest that you plan your trips around these regulations. There is only one city in North America that appears on the list done by Wired magazine. It is the city of Montreal. It ranks 20th on the list. As staff report has shown, the city of Montreal does not allow bikes on the metro during rush hour. So I agree. I think Ottawa should be taking lessons from major cities worldwide, especially cities in Europe and other places across North America that have a more ingrained bicycle culture. And those cities do not allow bikes on the trains during rush hour to avoid the conflict. We do want people to choose multiple modes of transportation, but we also want to avoid conflict. It is a limitation on cycling during rush hour that is proposed, and it's proposed to provide that limitation for a year so that data can be collected. What data? How many people are parking their bikes at the cycling stations? All of our cycling stations are going to have cycle parking. How many people are doing that? Do we have complaints about bicycles not being allowed? Off-peak, how many cyclists are using the service off-peak? Some people have said that it's limiting ridership. Well, as Mr. Scrimger has pointed out, to allow a single bike on or two in that station, you would be taking away space for 4 to 6 people. That is, by definition, then limiting ridership. So I think there are lots of reasons why we want to implement this in a moderated, cautious approach. We are asking our customers to go through a huge change. A year ago, people were asking to cut the price of bus fares because of the changes. We're implementing the biggest change in the history of our system. We're asking people today, largely most of whom ride and sit the entire time, from their door to where they get off, to not only make a transfer, but in the busiest hour of the day, when the trains are at capacity or near, most people will be standing. 2/3 of people on the train will be standing, and you'll be standing for most of your trip. That is a significant change, and I think it's a change we need to be mindful of, and so that's why I support a cautious approach in line with the staff recommendation to evaluate how it goes over the first year, to look at things like bicycle lockers and other elements that we can install in our major transfer stations to make it easier for people to cycle to the stations and then take the train the rest of their way. So staff will, over the lunch hour or lunch half hour, organize the motions and put them into the appropriate order because, frankly, there's a lot and they're not quite in order. And if we can be back in 1 half hour from now, so 20 to 1, and we can proceed from there. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, can we deal with the second motion though, before we do that while staff's doing this, or do we have to?
What's the second motion? Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll take 2 seconds. We need to waive the rules to add an item to the agenda. Commissioner Crew.
Given the timing, Mr. Chair, I'm wondering about simply proceeding with that by way of notice of motion to deal
Whatever
with
you'd like to do.
I think that's what I will do then.
Sure,
at that
okay.
stage. Yep.
So we're going to break for lunch. Come back half an hour, 20 to 1. Thanks, guys.